A fateful entry. The warm buzz of the evening crowd filled the Sunshine Diner, a retro-styled eatery in the heart of the city. Neon lights flickered outside, casting a faint glow on the black and white checkered floor. The scent of sizzling bacon and greasy fries wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of families, couples, and regulars perched on the red leather stools. Lisa Jones had been on her feet for hours. Her sharp features were drawn in a permanent frown, her red lipstick slightly smudged from a long shift. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing heavy trays and flashing a brittle smile that rarely reached her eyes. To Lisa, this wasn't just a job, it was survival. She had bills to pay, a small apartment to maintain, and no patience for anything, or anyone, that wasted her time. The diner's door jingled, drawing Lisa's attention. A boy, no older than 10, shuffled inside. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as he paused, taking in the crowded scene. His clothes, though clean, were faded and patched, and he clutched a small, crumpled envelope in his hands. Lisa's eyes narrowed as she watched him choose a booth by the window. It wasn't the first time a kid like him had wandered in. She'd seen it before. Street kids, runaways, or just troublemakers looking for a warm seat and a glass of water. With a sigh, she grabbed her notepad and strode over, her heels clicking with each step. "What can I get you?" she asked brusquely, tapping her pen against the pad. The boy looked up, startled. His large brown eyes held a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Hi, ma'am," he said softly. "Can I have a small burger and fries, please?" Lisa arched an eyebrow. Her gaze swept over him, lingering on the scuffed shoes and the envelope clutched in his hand. She didn't even bother to hide her skepticism. "A burger and fries? You sure about that, kid? That's $8.95, not counting the tip." The boy hesitated, his small hands fumbling with the envelope. He opened it carefully and poured out its contents onto the table, a few dollar bills and a handful of coins. He counted them slowly, his fingers trembling. "I think I have enough," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Lisa crossed her arms, her patience wearing thin. "Think. Look, kid, this isn't a charity. If you can't afford it, don't order it." Her voice carried across the diner, and conversations paused as heads turned toward the scene. The boy flushed a deep red, his hands still trembling as he tried to gather the coins. "Please, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been saving up for this. It's my birthday." For a moment, there was silence. Some of the customers exchanged glances, a few looking visibly uncomfortable. A mother at a nearby table reached for her purse, but her companion shook his head, whispering something about teaching the boy a lesson. Lisa, however, remained unmoved. "If it's your birthday, maybe your parents should have taken you out," she retorted. "Not come here with pocket change." The boy's eyes welled up, but he quickly wiped them with the sleeve of his jacket. "My dad's not here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But he promised we'd come here one day. He told me this was his favorite place." Lisa frowned, unsure if the boy was trying to guilt-trip her. She wasn't falling for it. "Look, kid, you're holding up my tables. Order something cheaper or leave." The boy bit his lip, his shoulders slumping. He began collecting the coins, fumbling as one rolled off the table and clinked to the floor. A man sitting near the counter cleared his throat loudly. "Hey, matey, cut the kid some slack," he said, his tone reproachful. Lisa shot him a withering look. "You want to cover his bill. Be my guest." The man hesitated, his hand hovering over his wallet, but before he could respond, the boy spoke up. "No, it's okay," he said quietly. "I don't need charity." The man withdrew, embarrassed, and Lisa smirked, satisfied. "That's what I thought." As the boy scooped up the last coin and stood to leave, the door jingled again. This time, the newcomer was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. He carried himself with a quiet authority, his sharp gaze scanning the diner before landing on the boy. His expression softened instantly. "David," the man said, his deep voice warm and steady. The boy froze, then turned. "Dad." Lisa blinked, taken aback. This was the boy's father. The man strode over to the boy, kneeling down to meet him at eye level. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I had a meeting I couldn't miss, but I'm here now." David's face lit up, the earlier embarrassment melting away. "I tried to order, Dad, but—" He trailed off, glancing at Lisa. The man followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as they met Lisa's. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Lisa hesitated, suddenly feeling exposed. No problem," she said quickly. "Just, making sure he could pay." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He straightened to his full height, towering over Lisa. "I see. Well, let's fix that, shall we?" He pulled out a sleek black wallet, extracting a crisp $100 bill. "This should cover his meal," he said, placing it on the table with deliberate precision. "And I trust the service will improve." Lisa swallowed hard, her face burning as the other customers murmured among themselves. She grabbed the bill and mumbled, "Of course, sir. Right away." As she hurried off, the man turned back to his son, his expression softening again. "Now let's order whatever you want, David. It's your birthday, after all." The boy beamed, the earlier humiliation forgotten. But for Lisa, the encounter was far from over. The man's face seemed oddly familiar, and as she glanced back from the counter, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She had no idea who she had just insulted, but she was about to find out. The storm brews. The Sunshine Diner was quieter now, the clinking of utensils and murmurs of conversation filling the space as Lisa retreated behind the counter. She kept herself busy, wiping down already clean surfaces and pretending not to notice the man and his son settling into the booth by the window. But her thoughts churned uneasily, the lingering tension from the confrontation still crackling in the air. The boy, David, was now animatedly chatting with his father, his earlier nervousness replaced by excitement. He pointed at the menu, his hands gesturing widely as he described something with enthusiasm. His father chuckled warmly, nodding as if savoring every word his son said. Lisa tried to shake off the discomfort. So what if the guy was wealthy? Plenty of well-off folks came through the diner. She could care less about another suit-wearing businessman, but something about him gnawed at her, a familiarity she couldn't place. His face, his voice, it all felt oddly significant, like a half-forgotten memory hovering just out of reach. As the other waitstaff whispered behind her, one of the cooks poked his head out from the kitchen, craning his neck to catch a glimpse of the man. "Hey, Lisa," he called, lowering his voice. "That guy over there, isn't that?" "Sha," Lisa hissed, shooting him a sharp look. "Mind your own business, Charlie." Charlie smirked, retreating back into the kitchen, but not before muttering something about big shots. Lisa rolled her eyes and tried to focus on her next table, but her movements were stiff, her mind preoccupied. Meanwhile, at the booth, David was oblivious to the growing attention around him. For the first time that evening, he felt at ease. His father's reassuring presence had washed away the sting of Lisa's words. He excitedly recounted his day, his voice filled with the kind of joy only a child could muster. "And then, Dad, I saved all my allowance because I wanted to surprise you. I thought you'd like it here," David said, his face glowing with pride. His father reached across the table, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "You did a great job, buddy. I'm proud of you, but next time, let me know. Okay, we'll come here together." David nodded eagerly, his smile stretching from ear to ear. "Okay, Dad." Their moment was interrupted as Lisa approached the table, her notepad in hand, and a forced smile plastered across her face. "Ready to order?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. The man's sharp gaze met hers, and for a moment, Lisa felt like she was being sized up. It wasn't just the look of a customer annoyed by poor service. It was deeper, more calculated, as though he were deciding whether she was even worth his time. "Yes," he said finally, his voice calm but commanding. "We'll take 2 deluxe burgers, 2 orders of fries, and a milkshake for the birthday boy." Lisa scribbled furiously, nodding. "Coming right up," she said, turning to leave. "Wait," the man called, stopping her in her tracks. She turned back reluctantly, her pen hovering over the notepad. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone neutral. Lisa blinked, startled. Lisa," she stammered. "Lisa," he repeated as though committing it to memory. Then, without another word, he turned back to his son. Lisa walked away, her heart racing. Something about the way he said her name felt significant, like it carried weight. She shook her head, brushing it off. Customers were always trying to make her uncomfortable. It came with the job. In the kitchen, Charlie leaned over the counter, a knowing smirk on his face. "You know who that is, right?" he whispered conspiratorially. Lisa ignored him, focusing on plating an order for another table. "No, and I don't care." Charlie chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, you'll care when you figure it out. That's James Carter." Lisa froze mid-motion, the plate nearly slipping from her hands. She turned slowly, narrowing her eyes. "Who?" "James Carter," Charlie repeated, leaning in closer. "The CEO of Carter Industries. You know, the guy whose company just signed that multi-billion-dollar deal last week. The one who's all over the news." Lisa's stomach dropped. The name rang a bell. No, it rang a gong. Carter Industries was a household name, known for its cutting-edge technology and philanthropic ventures. And James Carter himself was not just a businessman. He was a public figure, regularly featured in magazines and TV interviews. His face was unmistakable now that she thought about it. "That's not him," Lisa muttered, trying to convince herself. "Why would someone like that be here?" Charlie shrugged, smirking. "Guess you'll find out soon enough." Lisa turned away, her mind racing. If it was true, if she really had insulted James Carter's son, then this wasn't just any bad encounter. It could cost her more than just a bad tip. She stole another glance at the booth, watching as James leaned in to listen to his son's excited chatter. He seemed so ordinary. It didn't match the image she had of a billionaire mogul. Her thoughts were interrupted as James raised his hand, signaling her over. Taking a deep breath, she plastered on her best professional smile and approached the table. "Yes, sir?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. James didn't look up right away. Instead, he handed her the menu with deliberate slowness. When he finally met her gaze, his expression was unreadable. "I'd like to speak to your manager," he said, his tone polite but firm. Lisa's stomach churned. This was it, the moment her worst fears were confirmed. "Of course," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I'll get him right away." As she walked toward the manager's office, her heart pounded in her chest. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. This wasn't just a wealthy man with a grudge. This was James Carter, a man with influence, power, and the ability to make or break reputations. And she had humiliated his son in front of a crowd. Inside the office, her manager, a burly man named Joe, looked up from his paperwork with a frown. "What now?" he grumbled. "There's a customer asking to speak to you," Lisa said quickly. "The guy at table 7. Joe raised an eyebrow. "The guy with the kid. What's the problem?" Lisa hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. You should talk to him." Joe sighed, getting to his feet. "Fine, but this better not be another one of your incidents, Lisa." As Joe made his way to the booth, Lisa lingered near the counter, watching nervously. The conversation was brief, with James speaking calmly while Joe nodded along. At one point, Joe's expression turned grave, and he glanced toward Lisa before quickly looking away. When Joe returned, his face was unreadable. "Come to the back," he said curtly. Lisa followed him into the office, her heart in her throat. As soon as the door closed, Joe turned to her, his tone low and serious. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" Lisa nodded weakly. "I think so." "Then you know how badly you screwed up," Joe said, his voice tinged with frustration. "He's not just some guy, Lisa. That's James Carter, and he's not happy with how you treated his son." Lisa's face flushed. "I didn't know," she said defensively. "How was I supposed to?" "It doesn't matter," Joe cut her off. "You need to fix this. Now." Lisa swallowed hard, her mind racing. Fixing this wouldn't be easy, if it was even possible. But one thing was certain: James Carter wasn't going to let this slide. And neither would she, if she wanted to keep her job. The revelation. Lisa sat in the break room, the buzzing of the diner fading into a distant hum as her heart raced. The reality of her situation was sinking in fast. James Carter. The James Carter. She felt a cold sweat forming at the base of her neck as she realized how badly she had misjudged the boy and his father. This wasn't just about a bad tip anymore. It was about survival. The door creaked open, and Joe, her manager, stepped inside. He crossed his arms, his face stern. "Well?" he asked. Lisa blinked, unsure what he expected her to say. "What do you want me to do?" she asked defensively. Joe sighed, rubbing his temples. "Apologize. Be polite. Do whatever it takes to smooth this over. If he decides to complain, you won't just lose your job. A guy like that could shut this place down if he wanted to." Lisa swallowed hard, her pride warring with her growing fear. She wasn't one to back down easily. But this was different. This was James Carter, someone who could ruin her with a single phone call. At the booth, James Carter remained calm, his demeanor unchanged despite the tension hanging in the air. He watched his son, David, sipping his milkshake, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing around him. "Is it good?" James asked, his voice warm. David nodded enthusiastically. "It's the best, Dad. Thanks for taking me here." James smiled, but his thoughts lingered on the earlier exchange. He had spent his life building a reputation, not just as a businessman, but as someone who treated others with respect. Watching his son be humiliated like that had struck a nerve, and while he wasn't one to hold grudges, he believed in accountability. Lisa approached the table cautiously, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to." James held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His gaze was steady, neither angry nor forgiving. "Before you say anything, I'd like to ask you something." Lisa froze, her mouth dry. "Why, yes, sir." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "What made you think it was acceptable to speak to my son that way?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Lisa's throat tightened. She glanced at David, who was now looking down at his plate, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't mean to," she began, but James cut her off. "Don't tell me what you didn't mean," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Tell me why you did it." Lisa's defenses crumbled under his scrutiny. She had no excuse, at least none that would justify her behavior. She thought back to her initial reaction to the boy, his worn clothes, his shy demeanor, the handful of coins. She had judged him, plain and simple. "I thought," she started, then stopped. She couldn't bring herself to admit it. James sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You thought he couldn't pay. You saw a kid who didn't fit your idea of what a customer should look like, and you made a snap judgment." Lisa's face burned with shame. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have treated him that way." James nodded slowly, his expression softening just a fraction. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they don't erase the damage." Lisa felt a pang of guilt as she glanced at David. The boy still wouldn't meet her eyes, and the sight of his downcast expression twisted something deep inside her. She had been so quick to dismiss him, so quick to assume the worst. Back in the kitchen, Charlie peeked through the order window, watching the interaction unfold. Man, she's really in it now, he muttered to another cook. Think she'll get fired? The cook asked, flipping a burger with practiced ease. Charlie shrugged. Depends on how bad that guy's temper is. But Lisa's got a mouth on her. I wouldn't bet on her walking out of here with her job. As the tension at the table began to ease, James decided it was time to shift the conversation. David, he said, his tone gentle, why don't you tell me what you like about this diner? You picked it for a reason, didn't you? David perked up at the question, his earlier embarrassment fading. Yeah, you told me once that you used to come here all the time when you were a kid. You said it was your favorite place. James smiled, his expression turning nostalgic. That's right. My dad used to bring me here every Saturday. We'd sit in this very booth, and he'd tell me stories about his work. He said this diner reminded him that no matter how tough things got, there was always a place where you could feel at home. David beamed, clearly proud of his choice. I wanted to come here because I thought it would make you happy, Dad. Lisa, who had been lingering awkwardly nearby, felt a pang of regret. She had tarnished what should have been a special moment for them. I really am sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't fair to you or your son. James regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you mean that, he said. But an apology isn't just words, it's action. Lisa hesitated, unsure what he meant. What do you want me to do? She asked cautiously. James's gaze didn't waver. Treat every customer with respect, he said simply. Not just the ones who look like they can afford it. The word struck Lisa harder than she expected. She nodded slowly, realizing that this was more than just about her job. It was about who she wanted to be. As Lisa returned to the counter, she felt the weight of the encounter settling over her. For years, she had let her frustrations and assumptions dictate how she treated people. But tonight, she had been forced to confront the consequences of that mindset. She glanced back at James and David, watching as they laughed together, the earlier tension finally lifting. She didn't know what would come of this encounter, but one thing was certain. It was a moment she would never forget. The unexpected turn. The hours rolled on, and the Sunshine Diner's once bustling atmosphere quieted to a steady hum. Evening turned to night, and the neon lights outside flickered against the darkness. Lisa moved through her shift on autopilot, replaying her interaction with James Carter and his son in her mind. She had apologized, but the encounter had left her rattled. Something about the way James spoke, firm yet calm, piercing yet fair, had unnerved her. It wasn't just anger she had seen in his eyes. It was disappointment, and that stung more than she cared to admit. At the booth, James and David lingered. Their plates had been cleared, but they seemed in no hurry to leave. David was animated, drawing on the back of a napkin with a pen his father had given him. James watched his son with a soft smile, occasionally glancing out the window as though lost in thought. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. James Carter wasn't the type to let things go without making a point. Her manager, Joe, had made it clear she was on thin ice, but even he didn't seem to know what James had planned. As Lisa wiped down a table nearby, she heard James's voice cut through the quiet. Excuse me, Lisa. Her heart skipped a beat. She straightened, forcing a neutral expression onto her face as she turned to face him. Yes, sir. James gestured for her to come closer. She hesitated, glancing at Joe, who gave her a subtle nod from behind the counter. Taking a deep breath, she approached the booth, clutching her cleaning rag like a lifeline. Sit down, James said, motioning to the seat across from him. Lisa blinked, startled. I'm sorry. Sit, he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'd like to have a word with you. Lisa glanced at David, who was now watching her curiously, his napkin drawing momentarily forgotten. Reluctantly, she slid into the booth, her hands fidgeting in her lap. James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Do you know why I asked to speak with your manager earlier? He asked, his voice calm. Lisa swallowed hard. Because I was rude to your son, she admitted, her cheeks burning. James nodded slowly. "That's part of it," he said. "But it's more than that. I wanted to understand why someone like you, someone working in a place like this, would treat people the way you do." Lisa bristled at the comment, feeling a mix of shame and defensiveness. "I don't usually," she started, then trailed off. The truth was, she didn't know how to explain herself. She had been rude, and there was no excuse for it. James tilted his head, studying her. "Let me guess," he said. "You've had a hard day. Maybe even a hard life. You're tired, overworked, underpaid. Am I close?" Lisa blinked, caught off guard by his accuracy. "Something like that," she muttered. He nodded again, his expression unreadable. "I get it," he said. "Life isn't easy, and this job probably doesn't make it any easier. But that doesn't give you the right to take it out on people, especially not kids like David." Lisa flinched at the mention of his son. She glanced at David, who was now focused on his drawing again, seemingly oblivious to the tension between his father and the waitress. "You're right," Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my frustrations get the better of me. I shouldn't have treated him that way." James regarded her for a moment, then leaned back in his seat. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Lisa blinked, surprised. "It is." "Yes," James said. "But like I told you earlier, an apology isn't just words. It's about action. So I have a proposition for you." Lisa frowned, unsure where this was going. "A proposition?" James nodded, his expression turning serious. "I'm giving you a choice. You can continue working here, doing the same thing day in and day out, letting your frustrations build until they consume you. Or," he paused, his gaze steady, "you can do something different." Lisa frowned, confused. "What do you mean, different?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, sliding it across the table to her. "Come work for me," he said. "Carter Industries is always looking for people with potential. You might not see it in yourself, but I do." Lisa stared at the card, her mind reeling. "You want me to work for you?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. James shrugged. "Call it the second chance," he said. "You've got a sharp tongue, but I've seen people like you turn that into an asset. With the right guidance, you could do a lot more than wait tables." Lisa's hands trembled as she picked up the card, her eyes scanning the embossed letters. James Carter, CEO. Below his name was a phone number and an address. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled faintly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "Even people who make mistakes." Lisa's throat tightened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. She had spent so long feeling stuck, believing there was no way out of her dead-end job, no escape from the monotony of her life. And now, here was a man offering her a lifeline, a chance to start over. Back at the counter, Joe watched the exchange with a mix of curiosity and confusion. "What's he up to now?" he muttered to Charlie, who had joined him. Charlie smirked, shaking his head. "Looks like Lisa's getting more than just a talking to." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Charlie nodded toward the booth. "She's holding one of his business cards. Bet you $10 he's offering her a job." Joe snorted. "Yeah, right. Why would a guy like that hire someone like Lisa?" Charlie shrugged. "Guess he sees something in her." As James and David finally prepared to leave, Lisa remained at the booth, the business card still clutched in her hand. She watched them go, her emotions swirling in a whirlwind of confusion, gratitude, and hope. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: the possibility of change. Little did she know, this moment was just the beginning of a journey that would transform her life in ways she never imagined. A choice to make. The next morning, Lisa sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the business card James Carter had given her. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the small, cramped apartment she called home. The card felt impossibly heavy in her hand, its sleek design a stark contrast to the peeling linoleum beneath her feet and the chipped mug of coffee beside her. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Why had James Carter made such an offer? What did he see in her? And most importantly, could she really take such a leap? The idea of leaving her job at the diner was both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent years building a life of predictable misery, working double shifts, dealing with difficult customers, and barely scraping by. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. The thought of stepping into something entirely new, especially under the scrutiny of a man like James Carter, was enough to make her chest tighten. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her messy hair. On the counter, her phone buzzed. Pulling her out of her thoughts, she grabbed it and saw a text from Joe, her manager. "Joe, don't be late today. We're short-staffed." Lisa groaned, her stomach twisting. The thought of going back to the diner, facing the same grind, felt unbearable. But the alternative, a leap into the unknown, was equally daunting. Her gaze fell back to the card. She traced the embossed letters with her finger, her mind drifting back to the night before. James's words echoed in her head. Everyone deserves a second chance. The diner was busier than usual when Lisa arrived, the morning rush in full swing. She tied on her apron and got to work, slipping back into her routine like a well-worn pair of shoes. But something felt different. The familiar smells of coffee and bacon, the clatter of plates, and the chatter of customers. All of it felt muted, as though a veil had been lifted, revealing the drudgery she had tried so hard to ignore. "Lisa, table 3. Joe barked from behind the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. She grabbed her notepad and made her way to the table, plastering on a smile that felt hollow. As she took the customer's orders, her mind wandered, replaying her conversation with James Carter. The idea of working for him seemed absurd. What could she possibly offer to a man like that? But then again, hadn't he seen something in her? Something she hadn't seen in herself. During her lunch break, Lisa slipped out the back door and sat on the curb, the city's noise filling the air around her. She pulled out her phone and stared at the number on the card. Her thumb hovered over the keypad, her heart pounding. "Just call," she muttered to herself. What's the worst that could happen? But her courage faltered, and she shoved the phone back into her pocket with a frustrated sigh. She wasn't ready. Not yet. By the time her shift ended, Lisa was exhausted, but her mind was still buzzing. She walked home in the fading light, the city's neon signs casting colorful reflections on the wet pavement. Her thoughts churned with possibilities and fears, each one louder than the last. When she reached her apartment, she found a small envelope taped to her door. Frowning, she pulled it off and opened it, revealing a handwritten note inside. "Lisa, I wanted to thank you again for the way you handled things last night. It's not easy admitting when you're wrong, and it's even harder to take steps to make it right. That's why I believe you have what it takes to do something more with your life. If you're willing to take the first step, I'm willing to guide you the rest of the way. Call me when you're ready. James Carter." Lisa stared at the note, her heart pounding. How had he found her address? And why was he so insistent? It was unsettling, but it was also strangely encouraging. No one had ever believed in her like this before, not even herself. She sank onto her couch, the note and the card clutched in her hands. Her mind raced with possibilities. This was more than a job offer. It was a lifeline, a chance to rewrite her story. But could she do it? Could she step out of her comfort zone and take the risk? The next morning, Lisa woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what had changed overnight, but something inside her had shifted. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number on the card before she could talk herself out of it. The line rang twice before a calm, familiar voice answered. James Carter. Lisa's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Hi, Mr. Carter. This is Lisa, from the diner." There was a pause, then a smile in his voice. "Lisa, I wasn't sure if you'd call." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I think I'd like to take you up on your offer." James's tone was warm, reassuring. "Good. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning at 9. We'll discuss the details then." Lisa nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. Thank you, Mr. Carter. I really appreciate this." "You're welcome," he said. "And Lisa, call me James." As the call ended, Lisa sat in stunned silence, the weight of her decision settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel: hope. That night, Lisa sat at her kitchen table, staring at the business card one last time before tucking it into her purse. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. James Carter had given her a chance, a real chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter, and this time, she was ready to write her own story. New beginning. Lisa stood behind the counter, her eyes scanning the busy diner. The familiar sound of coffee brewing and the sizzle of bacon on the grill seemed distant today, as though she were watching it all through a foggy window. She had made the decision, albeit reluctantly, to go through with it. The night before, she had spent hours contemplating James Carter's offer, and while the fear of change still gnawed at her, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, hope, began to flicker within her. That morning, before her shift, she had called the number on the business card. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but James's calm demeanor had immediately put her at ease. He had been patient, understanding, and surprisingly encouraging. "Come by tomorrow. I'll explain everything. It's a chance for you to prove something to yourself," he had said. Lisa hadn't expected an invitation to something as monumental as this, a chance to leave the diner behind and enter the world of business. But here she was, stuck between the old world of greasy countertops and tips from fickle customers, and the new world where she could rewrite her story. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ring of the diner's phone, cutting through the hum of conversation. She sighed, wiped her hands on her apron, and picked it up. "Sunshine Diner. This is Lisa," she answered. A voice she didn't recognize spoke on the other end. It was warm, professional, yet with an underlying urgency. "Is this Lisa Jones?" "Yes, it is. How can I help you?" "This is Marcus Hudson. I'm the head of HR at Carter Enterprises. James Carter asked me to speak with you. He wanted to know if you're still interested in joining our team." Lisa's heart raced. The words seemed surreal, as though they were coming from a world far removed from the clatter of plates and the hum of the coffee machine. Yes, I am," she stammered, trying to compose herself. I thought it was just an offer, not a formal interview." "It's an opportunity," Marcus clarified, his tone patient. "Mr. Carter believes you have something unique to offer. Lisa, I won't keep you long, but I'd like you to come down to the office this afternoon. We can discuss the details, and if everything aligns, we'll have you on board." Her mind raced as she gripped the receiver tighter. Was she really about to make this kind of leap? To leave the diner, her only source of income, for something she wasn't entirely sure about? But a part of her, the part that had spent years in the trenches, just trying to survive, felt something that had been absent for far too long. Possibility. The afternoon was a blur. Lisa found herself in front of the towering glass building of Carter Enterprises, the same one she had driven by 100 times, always feeling as though it were an unreachable pinnacle. She stood outside, nervously adjusting her jacket and wiping her palms on her jeans. The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest, but she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, crossed a line she hadn't even known was there. There was no going back to the diner, to her old life. Inside, the building felt colder than she had imagined. The marble floors gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights, and sleek glass walls reflected the shadows of busy employees hustling in every direction. The receptionist, a young woman with sharp eyes and a polite smile, greeted Lisa and directed her to an elevator at the back. Lisa's nerves only intensified as the elevator hummed its way up to the top floor. She tried to calm her breathing, but the knots in her stomach only tightened with every floor that passed. When the doors opened, a sleek hallway greeted her, and at the end, a door with a polished sign that read James Carter, CEO. She knocked once before stepping inside. James Carter was seated behind a large mahogany desk, his back to her as he glanced over papers. His office was everything she had imagined it to be: modern, crisp, and undoubtedly expensive. He turned when he heard her approach, his eyes lighting up in recognition. "Lisa, thank you for coming," he said, standing to greet her with a firm handshake. "Please, sit down. Let's talk." Lisa took a seat, her heart thudding in her chest. There was a moment of silence as she collected her thoughts, staring at the desk that seemed to dwarf everything around her. James studied her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely empowered. "I won't waste your time," James began, leaning forward slightly. "You've worked in a diner for years, haven't you? You've probably served hundreds of people, each one with their own story. But there's something different about you, Lisa." Her brow furrowed, unsure of where this was going. "Most people would have taken one look at me, judged me as some entitled businessman, and gone on their way. But you didn't. You made a mistake, yes, but you owned it. You apologized. That tells me a lot about who you are as a person. People like you, people who are willing to learn from their mistakes and grow, don't come around often." Lisa's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this kind of honesty, this kind of understanding. "You have potential," James continued, his voice steady and persuasive. "I know it's a big leap, but I believe you could be more than just a waitress. I want you to come work for me, help with a few projects. I can teach you what you need to know. And in time, you'll learn to thrive in a new environment. It's not going to be easy, but you're not the type to shy away from hard work, are you?" Lisa felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy blanket. She wasn't the type to give up. She had worked hard her whole life, but it had always been for survival, not for growth. She had never known what it was like to be given a chance to truly thrive. Her mind raced as she thought about her life, the path she had carved out for herself. The familiar world of the diner, with its small, predictable moments, seemed so far away now. What did she really have to lose? "No," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm not afraid of hard work. I want to try this. I want to prove that I can do more." James smiled, a look of approval in his eyes. "Good. You've made the right choice." Lisa walked out of the building hours later, her mind still whirling with the enormity of what had just happened. She felt different somehow, lighter, freer. She had made the choice to step into the unknown, to move beyond the world that had defined her for so long. And as she looked up at the sky, the first signs of dawn creeping over the horizon, she realized that her life was no longer just about surviving. It was about living, truly living. For the first time, Lisa felt as though she was exactly where she was supposed to be.